Welcome to Amateur Bomb Museum, your arsenal and exhibit of revolutionary language. I'm your host, Victoria Brockmeyer, and today we're going to look at poems from an unusual book, Helen in Egypt, by an unusual poet named H.D. H.D. was born Hilda Doolittle. The story goes that she and Ezra Pound were having tea at the British Museum one day in the fall of 1912, and she showed him a few poems. He supposedly signed her poems for her, H.D. Imagiste, after Imagism, a movement in poetry for which Pound was both promoter and practitioner. She took the initials for her pen name and continued to publish poetry under them for the rest of her life. She also wrote novels and a memoir and did translations of ancient Greek texts. She even starred in early avant-garde films. Today we're on her poetry. H.D. isn't an easy poet to get into. She isn't an easy poet to teach. The poems aren't hard to read, but she draws from a tremendous store of knowledge, and everything she writes reflects and refracts through everything else she writes. She has images and ideas that she returns to repeatedly over decades, and she just keeps unfolding more layers and drawing more connections among all of them. To really get HD, you need to read her books as whole books instead of as collections of discrete poems. But you have to read them like poems, slowly and thoughtfully. You can't chug through the pages the way we do with fiction. Ideally, you should know classical and Egyptian mythology very well, and the archaeology of those civilizations, and botany, and the Earth's geological history, and astronomy, and astrology, and angelology, and alchemy, and the Victorian language of flowers, and early theories of psychoanalysis, and a fair bit about H.D.'s life. For starters. I can't give you all that today, but I think I can prepare you to take on more of H.D.'s poetry on your own if you're so inclined, and I hope you will be. She's fantastic. The Helen of this book's title is the Helen over whom the Trojan War was fought. Trojan War, in brief. Thetis, a sea nymph, marries a mortal man named Peleus. Zeus, the king of the gods, wants the marriage celebrations to go well, so he invites all the gods and goddesses except for Eris, who's the goddess of discord. She, of course, crashes, and she rolls a golden apple into the gathering that's engraved with "To the fairest." Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite all claim it, claiming to be the fairest. Eventually, another mortal man named Paris is asked to decide among them. He chooses Aphrodite. In return, she promises him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, who is already married to a Greek king named Menelaus. Aphrodite causes Helen to run off with Paris, and Menelaus' brother Agamemnon gets all the armies of Greece together to go lay siege to the city of Troy, which is where Paris is from, to get her back. It takes 10 very bloody years, but eventually they do win. This is a story told in the Iliad, whose main character is Achilles. And Achilles is the son of Thetis and Peleus, that initial couple. Greek mythology likes these familial threads that tie up together. H.D.'s Helen in Egypt is a book-length poetic series or sequence. It's 161 poems with one narrative, which she picks up from a fragment of an ancient poem by a poet named Stesichorus, who claims that Helen never went to Troy. Instead, Zeus whisked her away to Egypt and sent a statue of her to Troy, and that statue was what all the armies actually fought over. We don't have enough of Stesichorus's text to answer questions like, why would the Trojans have fought the Greeks for 10 years when they didn't even have Helen there? Such are the mysteries of archaeology. Anyway, it's basically ancient Greek myth alternate history. Helen of Troy fan fiction. H.D. takes that millennia-old fragment of a poem as a departure point for her sequence. Individually, the poems in Helen in Egypt are all definitely lyrics. They each present what we call a lyric moment, a significant, powerful freeze frame, a flash of vision. Making the poems links in a long, capacious chain gives H.D. more flexibility than poems meant to read on their own usually get. Many of the poems in Helen in Egypt depict dramatic moments between two characters, or sometimes with one character having an epiphany or feeling something powerful, and those are staged with settings and speeches and lots of concrete description, all the things we expect from stories. But other poems in here are very cerebral, just a character trying to think things through. Helen in Egypt is a story, beginning, middle, and end. But it's at least as much a meditation on relationships, time, and metaphysics. Very poemy. I wanted to bring Helen in Egypt to you because I feel like it's both underappreciated and hard to get a handle on. It hinges on one of the core stories of classical mythology, but it veers so far from it that even if you know your Iliad, you're going to go, wait, what? Reading it. Second, because it's also concerned with genuinely heady concepts about the nature of myth and how figures from myth experience time and whether there's a difference between life and death. And finally, because it has a weird form even as book-length poetic series go. Each individual poem has an introductory bit, or as H.D. called them, a caption, written in prose. H.D. originally wrote the entire sequence without these interstitial introductory prose bits. They're looser, less exciting writing than the poetry, and a number of them tell you what the poem you're about to read is going to say, so they can have a flattening effect. They will quote the poems they're about to introduce, which of course you're about to read, and they'll quote other poems from the sequence which you will often have just read. A lot of them include long sequences of questions that they never answer. Several of the captions even seem to undermine the poems. They'll say things like, Helen understands such and such a thing, but we do not understand it. Or, Helen says this, but the reality is this other thing. Of what criticism has been written about Helen in Egypt, a lot of it has just been about how to deal with these prose sections. They're weird, which, for me, immediately means they're interesting. The two pieces I pulled out for us are both from the book's first section, called Palinode. First, Palinode, Book 1, Poem 8, which has the longest prose caption in all of Helen in Egypt. To set this scene for you, Helen and Achilles have just met on a deserted beach at night in Egypt, sometime after the Trojan War. Helen knows who Achilles is, but he doesn't recognize her at first. The poem before this one mentioned Achilles being afraid because he's been shipwrecked and he isn't sure where he is, hence this one's caption begins. She is afraid too, so she needs this protection. She has tried to conceal her identity with mockery. I am a woman of pleasure. She knows what the Greeks think of her, and here is Greece incarnate, the hero god. True, he is shipwrecked. Nevertheless, though wounded, he carries with him the threat of autocracy. She has lost caste. He is still Achilles. Or who is she? She says that Helen upon the ramparts was a phantom. Then what is this Helen? Are they both ghosts? And if she is convinced of this, why does she entreat the flame that Achilles kindled? Let me love him as Thetis, his mother. Is she afraid of losing even her phantom integrity? And what of it? Thetis, Isis, Aphrodite. It was not her fault. Oh, no. But through eternity she will be blamed for this, and she feels it coming. She will blacken her face like the prophetic femme noire of antiquity. But it does not work. Achilles is here to impeach her. Why? We must blame someone. Hecate, a witch, a vulture, and finally, as if he had run out of common invective, he taunts her, a hieroglyph. This is almost funny. She must stop him. He is, after all, the son of the sea goddess. She is named Isis, the Egyptian Aphrodite, the primal cause of all the madness. But another born of the sea is nearer, his own mother. Again she thinks of her and reminds Achilles of his divine origin, O child of Thetis. This is quite enough. Can you throttle a phantom? He tries. The end is inevitable. How could I hide my eyes? How could I veil my face? With ash or charcoal from the embers? I drew out a blackened stick, but he snatched it, he flung it back. What sort of enchantment is this? What art will you wield with a faggot? Are you Hecate? Are you a witch? A vulture? A hieroglyph? The sign or the name of a goddess? What sort of goddess is this? Where are we? Who are you? Where is this desolate coast? Who am I? Am I a ghost? You are living, O child of Thetis, as you never lived before. Then he caught at my wrist. Helena, cursed of Greece. I have seen you on the ramparts. No art is beneath your power. You stole the chosen, the flower of all time, of all history, my children, my legions. For you were the ships burnt. Oh, cursed, oh, envious Isis, you, a vulture, a hieroglyph. Zeus be my witness, I said. It was he, Ammon, dreamed of all this phantasmagoria of Troy. It was dream and a fantasy. Oh, Thetis, oh, sea mother, I prayed, as he clutched my throat with his fingers' remorseless steel. Let me go out. Let me forget. Let me be lost. Oh, Thetis, oh, sea mother, I prayed under his cloak. Let me remember forever this star in the night. As the caption tells us, Helen knows what the Greeks think of her, and here is Greece incarnate. She does not want Achilles to figure out who she is at first, and so she tries to hide her identity by smearing her face and arms with soot. Achilles stops her, though, and has a breakdown. He begins to recover the memories of his life and to understand his situation, and he does not like it. A couple notes on the deities HD has Helen invoke. Amun is Amun-Ra, spelled by archaeologists today A-M-U-N. When I was a kid and really into Indiana Jones, it was A-M-O-N. Today he gets a U. He is the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. In earlier books, HD develops a syncretic pair of divinities, a god and goddess who are each made up of lots and lots of deities from different cultures, including ancient Egypt. She spells Amun A-M-E-N because her Amun is not only Egyptian Amun-Ra, but also Thoth, another Egyptian god, Zeus, as we see here, importantly, Jesus, and a bunch of other gods, and some angels, and assorted mythical and biblical humans. This is what's behind Helen mentioning earlier that she prays that she be able to love Achilles like Thetis, his mother, which confuses Helen herself, not to mention HD's reader. It's more than I can unpack here, but it ends up being grounded in HD's approach to thinking about what myths are and how they relate to one another. Helen works out the metaphysics of this over the course of the book. Anyway, this spelling of Amun intentionally evokes Christianity in with the ancient Egyptian and Greek religion. Hecate, whom Achilles accuses Helen of being, is what we call a chthonic deity, one associated with the underworld and dangerous, spooky things in general. Neo-pagans today like her as a goddess of witchcraft, and HD did too. But Achilles figures out, no, this is Helen, the Helen, for whom all the warriors of Greece which he led fought, and for whom a lot of them died. In spite of her desire for Achilles not to remember the war or who she is, she disrupts his amnesia, calling him child of Thetis, a phrase that simultaneously invokes Achilles' half-divine nature and the wedding of his parents, where a jealous heiress introduced the discord that would blossom into the entire Trojan War. That's the connection between Achilles and Helen, too, which the poem underscores concretely as Achilles grabs Helen's wrist. And then the accusations she feared. His line, "No art is beneath your power," is interesting. We might expect someone to say no art is beyond your power, maybe to a character they really respect. This is no art is beneath your power. He's recognizing her power, and in the same moment denouncing it, saying that she'd do any terrible thing just to wreck the world. It's significant that he calls her a vulture, too. It's an insult in that vultures are famously ugly birds and famously disgusting as carrion feeders. The implication is that Helen grew strong on the dead Greeks, the flower of all time, of all history. However, the vulture is also the animal of Nekhbet, who was originally the patron goddess of Nekheb, a major city in Upper Egypt. When ancient Egypt got united into a single kingdom, she became one of its two core patron deities. HD knows exactly what she's having Achilles do here, even if he doesn't, associating Helen with Nekhbet. He may be furious at her and afraid of her, but he reveres her too, as the symbol, the soul of a nation. not a bad match for the hero godling of Greece incarnate. The book only shows a couple interactions between Helen and Achilles, and this one is by far the most vivid. She's going to encounter Paris and then another hero, Theseus, in the sequence, and she'll consider their characters and the different kinds of love each offers. Achilles is associated with anger, war, and death, and yet this moment where he recovers his memories, has kind of an existential crisis and freaks out, attacks her, and then the prose claims inevitably kisses her. This is the one thing that, no matter what, Helen wants to remember for eternity. H.D. is working with the ancient Greek model of death and the afterlife, by the way. You've probably heard of at least a couple of their underworld rivers: Acheron, Phlegethon, Cocytus, Lethe, and Styx. Lethe means forgetfulness. Drinking from it on the way to Elysium caused the dead to forget their lives on Earth. When Achilles is choking Helen, she first prays to forget, to complete that process, lose herself completely. It's as close as a dead person can get to wishing for suicide. When he suddenly kisses her instead, that restores her will to live, however much that applies to a ghost. How H.D. wants us to feel about this, I don't know. Her relationships with men were often difficult. She was involved romantically and artistically with several powerful male modernist writers who treated her terribly. Pound obliterating her gender and appointing her as a representative of his aesthetic movement is one of the least upsetting stories there are about H.D. and men. She did have a female partner named Ryer who stayed with her for about 40 years, through to the end of her life, and who was supportive in every way. But Helen in Egypt only gives us Helen with men. While the book seems to come down ultimately on Theseus's side, if you read through it, as Helen's best partner, she returns mentally over and over again to this moment of eroticized violence with Achilles. As in this poem, she prays repeatedly not to forget it, out of all the experiences of her life and afterlife. The prose captions may offer a way to approach this moment, which is so key to the work and so weird. Remember that I said they sometimes undercut Helen, correcting her impressions or explaining things to the readers that she doesn't know. This gives the book Helen in Egypt its own wiser perspective, distinct from that of its main character. The introductory bits therefore let us argue that H.D. knows better, and Helen is a character, not just a mouthpiece for the poet herself, even if aspects of the relationships depicted resemble some of the ones H.D. actually had. The captions establish another perspective definitively within the same text. Now, they don't actually comment on this moment, other than to remind us how important it is to Helen, but their general position opens up the strong possibility that H.D. wants to testify to the erotic power of violence by men against women, but that doesn't mean she approves of it. So, while it's tempting to skip them, in comparison to the poems proper, don't do it. Read all of it. Hopefully this gives you a glimpse into H.D.'s poetic praxis in general. The second piece I've picked out will show you what's cool about this book in particular. You do need one piece of information that comes up between the first piece I read and this one. When Achilles attacked Helen, she felt a rush of wings all around her. She determines that this was the ghosts of all the Greek soldiers who died, protecting her from Achilles' anger. Why he moves from fury to lust never really gets explained. The book claims that they exchanged a glance across the battlefield once that initiated his passion for her, but that doesn't really justify turning that attack into an embrace. What we do know is that Helen feels these numberless ghosts swirling around them, and then Achilles kisses her instead of trying to kill her. Again from Palinode, Book 2, Poem 4. Helen is a Greek, a Spartan, born from a seafaring people. Although in Egypt, it is not the primitive caravel, as she calls the shadow or death ship of Osiris, that she visualizes when she would recall the host of spirits. Her vision is wholly Greek, though she returns to the sacred Egyptian lily for her final inspiration. This is the spread of wings, whether the Straits claimed them or the Cyclades. whether they floundered on the Pontic seas or ran aground before the Hellespont, whether they shouted victory at the gate, whether the bowmen shot them from the walls, whether they crowded, surging through the breach, or died of fever on the smitten plain, whether they rallied and came home again in the worn hulks, half rotted from the salt or sun-warped on the beach, whether they, scattered or in companies or 3 or 2, sought the old ways of home, whether they wandered, as Odysseus did, encountering new adventure, they are one. No, I was not instructed, but I read the script. I read the writing when he seized my throat. This was his anger. They were mine, not his, the unnumbered host. Mine all the ships, mine all the 1,000 petals of the rose, mine all the lily petals, mine the great spread of wings, the 1,000 sails, the 1,000 feathered darts that sped them home, mine the one dart in the Achilles heel, the 1,001, mine. This is the most kick-ass Helen of Troy I know of, written or filmed or anywhere. She tells us, elsewhere in this book, that she actually caused Achilles to come to this beach and find her, that she knows things about the war, about Achilles, about the gods that no one else knows, and even that she herself is identical to Isis and Aphrodite. She's troubled and introspective at some points, and brilliantly bold and sure of herself in others, sometimes in the same poem. It's a phenomenal portrayal of the character, completely original. The first line of the Iliad translates as, "Sing in me, muse, of the anger of Achilles." Anger is his deal. The entirety of that massive poem's action grows out of it. He's angry over being denied a girl the armies capture, angry when his friend and probably lover Patroclus gets killed, so angry, in fact, that he not only eventually routs all the armies of Troy, but sacrifices a random brace of young boys, defiles the Trojan hero Hector's corpse, picks a fight with a river, and on and on. H.D.'s Helen has this epiphany unique to this portrayal of her, that actually the driver of all that anger is jealousy. Jealousy of her. While she's reconfiguring the story of Helen, H.D. expands the story of the soldiers who died at Troy, too. She has Helen follow out their different fates. Some died at sea before they even got to Troy, some died in the battle itself, some fell to plague, and some, quickly or slowly, made it home to live out normal lives. There's a section early in the Iliad called the Catalogue of Ships, and if you've read the Iliad, you probably just winced because it's so long and so boring. The Iliad spends what feels like pages and pages, it's not, but it feels that way, listing off how many ships full of soldiers each Greek city-state sent, where they came from, and who led them. The first part of this poem of H.D.'s is mercifully much shorter, but it reprises that basic structure, listing off where the fighters ended up rather than where they came from. Then, it reunifies them, including those who never even made it to the battle, as a host of spirits who come together to protect Helen. They are one. It's kind of nice to get them all together and even give them a unified purpose after all their deaths. The Iliad, and classical literature in general, don't offer much of that kind of resolution. This is all H.D. Previously in the book, H.D. had said she was instructed how to read the script of the natural world. Specifically, she interprets a bird that flies over their heads at night. It's not that she divines a prophecy out of that event, or gets anything so concrete. It's some kind of deep knowledge of what the bird is, and that it's sacred to the goddess Isis. The prose tells us, no, actually she wasn't instructed, but accessed some kind of intuitive or emotional knowledge. Now, by this slightly later poem, she's come to agree with that. Helen in Egypt does a lot of working through what reading and writing are ontologically and what they can do. It says repeatedly that Helen herself is the writing. Achilles gets this, somehow, because he throws that weird insult at her in the first poem I read, calling her a hieroglyph on that first night. That is about as much clarity as the book provides on how a person can be writing. To read a poet like H.D., you have to be willing not to understand things on a first read, and comfortable with the possibility that you'll never understand some of what she writes. I have a sense of what she's saying with that, and I have my own theories that might be relevant about the relationship between a poet and her literary output, but there's not enough that I could really explain to you what it means that Helen is a hieroglyph, that she is the writing to you. Maybe I'll write an essay about it, and then I'll be able to explain what I think she's saying. But even if I do that someday, it would leave plenty of room for argument, for other interpretations. This is the stuff dissertation chapters are made of. Whatever textual metaphysics HD is working with, though, Helen gets her major epiphany when Achilles attacks her, which she revisits here. In that moment, with the hordes of the dead protecting her, she reads the script, reads herself, that is. This tells her that our whole understanding of the Trojan War is wrong. The soldiers of Greece fought and died for her, the woman they went to recover, rather than for Achilles, the warrior who led them to victory. Or, for that matter, for Menelaus, her abandoned husband, or for Agamemnon, his brother who called the armies to war in the first place. Even Achilles' death, he's shot with an arrow in the back of the ankle, the tendon we still call the Achilles tendon, she even claims that. And it is what sends him to this afterlife with her in Egypt, so her claim strengthens the idea that she drew him to her, brought him there. The rose and the lily here are symbols that stand for infinity. The kind of lily HD's talking about, which she calls Egyptian, the lotus or water lily, appears in a lot of occult and New Age materials with petals that unfold infinitely from its center. The rose does too, as a kind of westernized version of the same image. HD's contemporaries, T.S. Eliot and William Carlos Williams, among others, used roses in their own poems dealing with human experiences of the infinite. Achilles described the Greek legions as the flower of all time, of all history, emphasizing their importance and probably their beauty. HD's Helen takes his flower image and recasts it to emphasize their numerousness. Focus on that for a second. Helen in Egypt makes Greece's heroic fighters literally invisible, reduces them to a faint, silent sensation of wings that circles protectively around our protagonist. It's not much of a leap to describe this as objectifying them. So, HD's story of Helen and Achilles doesn't just add to what we know of them from the canon, it completely reverses their positions. Achilles isn't the main character. He's but one among several of her romantic interests, although he does speak. He's also just one member of the vast army of men who fought over her, ultimate, important for his relationship to Helen, not for his position as a military leader. All his men, after all, end up protecting her against him. Helen knows and understands much more about their situation, and it's her knowledge that triggers Achilles to recover his own memories. She's really the prime mover through the entire text. Without her reminding him of his origins, as far as we know, he would have remained an amnesiac, wandering around an empty beach. In the story classical Greece handed down to us, the Iliad, Helen is basically a token Aphrodite controls, a reward that goddess gives to a man who calls her the prettiest. That Helen might as well be a statue. In that sense, Stesichorus's weird idea that Helen herself never went to Troy might be the only way to explain her story. Any real living woman would be more interesting and more powerful than the Helen Greek myth gave us. HD's inventions in this book are over and over again directed against the received literary tradition, the received misogynist literary tradition. She writes with emotional weight and all this powerful, believable detail that gives us an alternative to thousands of years of these male-centered stories that we've told and retold and retold again. Recently, one of my friends who's working on a novel told me that he was having trouble getting a well-developed female perspective in his book. I knew he had an important character who was female, and after talking to him a bit, I suggested that all he needed to do was just give her more pages. HD's Helen is a strong character. Not action movie strong, like Sigourney Weaver in Alien or Furiosa in the new Mad Max, awesome as those characters are, but strong as a character. She's complex, compelling, emotionally resonant. She encounters and rejects different men, different homes, different notions of reality. She comes to her own interpretations of the circumstances of her life and her afterlife. And crucially, she makes her own choices. Choosing to hold on to the memory of her first strange kiss with Achilles over anything else is, after all, distinctly Helen. It's ambivalent, it's complicated, It might not be the healthiest thing she could do for herself, but it's interesting. And it's believable as an independent choice that an independent, imperfect, 100% real person could make. This is how you get a female perspective in a book. Have a woman do things. Maybe have her think about the things she does. Make her actions affect the world you build. We're getting better about this. The new Supergirl and Wonder Woman show that off in spectacular fashion, but some of us, including some of us with all the right motivations, still have trouble seeing women as the main characters in their own stories. We'll get there. If you like what you've heard here, share a link to the show around your social media channels. Give me a little love. You can also support me on Patreon now at www.patreon.com/Victoria Brockmeyer and get exclusive insights into the life and mind of a poet, that being me. Send your questions, comments, poem requests, and uninterpretable prophecies as an ask at the Tumblr, amateurbombmuseum.tumblr.com, or email them to me at amateur.bomb.museum@gmail.com. And I'll see you next time with a poem or two by the inimitable and incredible Emily Dickinson.